Sam, defend your team, because they haven't won.
Strap yourselves in, it's another 1 hour episode.
Oh, yeah.
Spike defused.
Welcome to Press 4 to Defuse, everybody. It is a new episode, and my co-hosts have abandoned me. The usual suspects are not here. Ryan's off doing VCT. What's that about? Sam's off wandering on an island somewhere. But coming in from the cold to keep me company, we've got Anderzz here to talk to us about all things VCT. He is the coach of VIRTUOSO. He is a man who is very analytically driven. You've probably seen some of his stats content. If you haven't, what are you doing? Check out his YouTube channel. Check out the runs that VIRTUOSO's been making. How you doing today, Anderzz?
I am doing fantastic. It's hard to be doing poorly after the recent run we had, so excited to talk all the craziness that's going on in NA and everywhere for that matter.
I will be completely honest, I can't hear you really at all. You're incredibly faint, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to be heard by stream right now. Hopefully we're getting that one sorted out in just a second here. We've lost him. We've lost his audio. Oh. He's wandered off. I wonder if stream can hear you perfectly fine, and that's just me being crazy or sounding crazy to them. Stream can hear you. Okay.
Okay, awesome.
I'm going to put my listening ears
on. We're halfway
on,
there.
I guess we're just going to get real in with it. Can you give us a line here?
Yeah, I can give you a line, but can you hear me? That's the better question.
All right, I'm gonna have to really try for this one. Okay, we've got a lot to talk about here on Valorant, on Press 4 Defuse. Lots of Valorant stuff to talk about, and I'm going to try and hear my co-host here. Got a lot of information to go on, too, but we're going to start with a section that we like to call Run It Back, where we are going to talk about things that have happened in this past week. There's been a few roster changes. Obviously, a lot of teams had some disappointing results in the first Challengers run, and so they're already making changes to accommodate that. And the biggest name so far is TSM, who have announced that they are benching Drone. So let's hop into it, talk about that. Anderzz, what do you make of Drone being out of the team?
So it was pretty obvious that... Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. I'm
awesome,
very excited
perfect.
About that fact.
Excellent. So I think that TSM making a major change was pretty much an inevitability based off of their run. I think that Drone being the one to move out is a little bit perplexing. I think that like the overarching story of TSM right now is no one has any idea what's going on with the roster. I'm not sure they have any idea what's going on with the roster. It feels like their roles are really jumbled, and I feel like of the elements that they could have swapped out, Drone was nowhere near the top of my list. I think that in terms of his ability to pivot back into the Sova role that he had tons of success on, or being able to pivot back into the Phoenix role, where, I mean, a lot of people were comparing him to Sick, and Sick is, in a lot of people's measurement, the best player in North America. It's hard to understand why this is the person being dropped from that team, but hopefully it pays off for them. I mean, obviously something had to give, so whether this was it, we'll have to see.
I'm very excited for the change, oddly enough, not for TSM's sake, but because I really want to see Drone on another team. Drone was my favorite player in the early days of competition, like by and large, like back in the beta, back in the early tournaments, when TSM was the most exciting team in NA Valorant, Drone was the best player to watch. I know people love Wardell, the flashy op antics and all this. Doesn't interest me. What Drone was doing on the Sova in the early days, and then when he started switching over towards the duelists, towards getting more engagement there, I loved what he was doing. I love what he brought to the table, and I love what he's been doing. And you're talking about him being a versatile. And again, Sova is still the most reliably picked agent for any region in any composition. The only agent that's really a must pick in a lot of situations. So I love the fact that Drone's going to get a chance on another team, hopefully. Don't love the move for TSM. Really don't love the move for TSM. I think that this was a massive mistake. I think that, yes, it hasn't been good, and they are trying to figure things out, but I absolutely agree with your point where they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing with this roster. They're constantly trying to make moves. I get that the theory of Chet as coach is very exciting, but he has yet to actually have success with a roster in Valorant. There's just... I don't get it. I do not understand the change. I don't love it for them. We'll move on from it, but I will say, again, the upshot from this is that hopefully Drone's going to find his way to another top-tier roster, and we're going to get to see Drone do Drone things in a different context, and that's something I am really excited for, something that I really hope comes to pass, and that it gets another chance to compete, and that this doesn't tarnish his reputation within the scene. On the next thing, hopping regions entirely, Lakia has revealed his new home, headed to Vision Strikers. This one was pretty inevitable once he left New Turn. It's like, okay, well, why are you leaving New Turn after you just had an amazing result? You're leaving them because Vision Strikers rolled out the Banks Chuck. How do we feel about this? Lakia bringing firepower back to Vision Strikers.
It's gonna be wild, man. Like, it's gonna be so insane. When I originally saw him leaving Newton, I was like, surely he's only going to Vision Strikers. There's nowhere else that makes any sense unless some E or a NA org decided to throw a bag at him and his English is way better than I thought it was. But him going to Vision Strikers, I mean, this could be the start of the Vision Strikers redemption arc. I mean, is this what makes us see them in Berlin and potentially making it to champions at the end of the year? Because Lakia was a standout for most people in Reykjavik. I mean, it's hard to look at their matches and not say that Lakia was a pivotal, if not absolutely mandatory element in the way that they found their wins. So to see him go on to the previous, like, 111 win streak team in Korea, if you're not excited about it, I don't know what's going to get you excited.
Yeah, really. This is so exciting for the region in general. He's also the player with one of the most personality players in the region, right? He was having so much fun with the cams, with the pregame rituals, with the snipping off of the cat ears. Like, they were having a good time. So I love the fact that Lakey is going to move to another roster, get another chance to really show his stuff and really strut a little bit. So very exciting there. Next, moving on, we've got Trainer out at LG. I think this move was kind of in the works for a while. It did seem like Mac was more and more taking the reins there in terms of the coaching thing. But I will say, Trainer had a pretty big track record of success with that Luminosity team. He was a big part of their rise when they came from being a sort of tier 3 team to being constantly competitive in every Champions Closed event. So I want to get your thoughts on this, right? As a fellow coach, as somebody who's thought a lot about coaching in this game, what do you make of the move from Trainer to Mac?
So, I mean, there are often two situations when you see coaches being moved from rosters like this, and it's either the coach being scapegoated or someone coming up who is just consistently providing more value than the current coach. And I think it's more the latter case than the prior case here, where LG is sort of struggling a little bit. The players probably have a little bit more faith in Mac as a coach and in his capabilities to help them succeed, and so they made that pivot. It oftentimes will get to a point where when you have two strong voices in a coaching or analytical capacity for a team, you get that too many chefs in the kitchen effect, and this is probably a reflection of them wanting to have a more unified, singular vision to move forward for.
I do like that. I also know Mac. I know Mac personally from his CS days. He's a dynamic kid. He's a dynamic dude. I guess he's not even a kid anymore. He's grown up. He's a man now. He's a coaching man. But he is a strong personality, to say the least, and a strong voice. So I am curious to see, now that this team's fully under his direction, what they could do if they can kind of go for this bounce back and this rebuild, and what this new look Luminosity is going to be now that they've got the Dazzle and Ban in there. Now they've got Tig standing in for Moose temporarily. I mean, presumably we'll have to wait a little bit till Moose wrist heals up from punching all those bears to really see the full form of this team, but I am curious to see how they're going to do down the stretch. Heading down my list, Thwifo is out of the XSET squad. That was he's the piece who went out. Zekin came in. Thwifo is now officially benched. What do we make of Thwifo being on the market?
I mean, it's another case of I would have a really hard time understanding this decision if Zekin wasn't the one coming in for him.
Yeah.
I think that's the only reason this switch isn't like just a huge question mark. I think Thwifo is going to have zero difficulty landing on his feet. He's going to find a new team with almost no trouble whatsoever. I think that XSET just saw an opportunity that they couldn't pass up, and he unfortunately got the short end of the stick on it.
They do feel like an organization that's making really aggressive moves to improve, right? Bringing in Def, now bringing in Zekin. They're already qualified through this first round of the VCT Champions into the main event, which we're going to be talking about for this weekend. We're going to be looking at for this weekend. But I am very curious to see what this new look, how deep they can go, right? Because XSET was a perennial top 4. They kept getting that top 4, and then they kept going out 4th, 3rd, not quite being able to push for the crown. And it's clear that they've decided that that's not enough, right? That's not enough to be in the conversation, to be in the dance. They want to be there contending for the title. They want to make it to Berlin, and they've been very aggressive in pursuing and doing so. In a context where, honestly, I think most of their fans would have been completely fine with them treading water and staying the course. So I'm curious to see if this will be the shot to get them right over the top, to put them competitive with the Sentinels, competitive, with a version 1 right there at the upper echelon. Kansas City Pioneers. This is going to be a fun one for you to talk about. We'll talk about them more later on. Obviously, your team VIRTUOSO had a little bit of a run-in with them. Wasn't a great run-in for you guys. This team doing damage already. Obviously, it's way easier to talk about them now that they've already qualified through to the closed. But Odorous, JMO, Physics, Scuba, Scourge, some very talented names, some guys that I've known for a long time from their CS days. Odorous in particular, I was so disappointed when he joined that Beast Coast team, said he was going to be the IGL. That was so exciting, and then they immediately shit-canned the project and shut it all down, and we never really got to see the team. Well, now we're seeing the team. Now we're seeing what they're doing, and it is incredibly exciting, very encouraging early results. We'll talk more about them later, but just give me like a quick thought on this Pioneers roster, because I know you've been thinking about them an unfortunate amount.
The quick hit as it pertains to the roster being announced is that a lot of people see these guys as like the old FPLC, old United stack. There are some pieces here that are not continuous with that narrative, that weren't with them when they were on a United, that weren't with them when they were FPLC. This roster is way better than those ever were. And that is like the key thing that I would take away from this is the roster that KCP picked up was not United of old, and you should have completely different expectations for them because they're a completely different beast.
That has me all sorts of excited. We got one more mention here, which is that Nerfed, my boy Nerfed, is back competing with a Big Frames roster. He's off of SOAR. According to his tweet, it's mutual agreement. Always kind of a little bit weird to know who's benching, who's mutually agreeing. I will say, in the course of history of teams with Nerfed getting picked up, teams with Nerf then tend to eventually make the decision to remove Nerfed. See the Renegades, then see, what was the next one? Then it doesn't go well for them, historically. Usually, they then drop way the heck off, lose their form, kind of lose what they were doing, and it takes a while to find their form again. Do you agree with that statement?
I mean, based off of SOAR going out in the round of 16 in the NSG Open yesterday, it's kind of hard to disagree. Yeah. Just saying.
It's just, he brings a lot to a team outside of his raw fragging ability, and this is the classic situation of, you target the guy who's bottom of the board in some situations where you say, okay, well, he's not having the impact. But you got to imagine, one of the things that Jimmy brings, Jimmy being nerfed, is he's a much older player than most of these guys are going to be. He's in his late 20s, 30s at this point. He's got a wife. He's got kids. Like, he's got a life. So he's a much more level-headed dude. The other thing is he has a sports background. He was a very competitive wrestler once upon a time, so he's experienced with coaching. He has experience with a sports-based mentality, with competition in that regard, in a way that people who grew up in esports, in pugging, and that kind of thing don't necessarily have the same background. And it can be super useful for a team to keeping the mental on track, to focusing on what they need to focus on to improve. I think he's a very valuable asset to a team outside of his raw impact as an individual in the server. I think he's a much more meta piece, if you will. So I don't know what exactly the background is here. Obviously, the other thing for Nerfed is that he's not really my understanding is that he's not really reliant on an organization's salary in the same way that other players would be. So if he genuinely didn't believe in this project anymore, he may have just made the decision to leave on his own. I'm not sure what exactly is going on there, but I will say, whatever team Nerfed's on, I'm interested in.
Yeah, I'm just happy to see that he's still sticking around. That is the only scenario that I would be really unhappy with if it was him leaving a team and him not picking back up the Big Frames banner. The fact that he always goes back to that always puts a smile on my face, because to see him around kicking in the sort of tier 2 circuit that my VIRTUOSO guys play it feels like something as natural as waking up in the morning. It would be really weird to not have him around. So,
and he's fantastic as well in terms of talking about that experience and how long he's been competing for bringing up newer, younger players as well and building these rosters. He keeps getting teams signed. And if that is Nerf's contribution to the scene, I'm all for it. If he just keeps continuing to build these projects and getting them signed to organizations and then, like, moving on to do more. It's like, my work here is done. He walks off into the sunset to build another roster for NA. You love to see it. Moving on. VCT. Oh boy. All right, we're going to start here in NA talking about the Open. This is super exciting. Obviously, it was a very exciting run for you guys as well, which we'll get to. Holy upsets, Batman. So many upsets. The world order, like there's still the top, but then everything below that feels like it's in chaos. Everything feels like it's been thrown completely into chaos. We've got our qualified teams there. Sentinels, Xset, Envy. Those are all normal. Version 1, still normal. 100 Thieves, yeah, okay, they did well. Kansas City Pioneers, Rise, and Gen G. So I would say at least 2 of those are very surprising. The other one is technically Gen G versus Ambox was an upset. We can get into that a little bit more, whether we think that was, in fact, an upset. Your whole side of the bracket was a lot of fun. You guys toppling NRG, and then the battle against the Pioneers, but the Pioneers also toppling Immortals. So let's start there. Let's start with your chunk of the bracket. Talk to me about that NRG game, because you guys trounced them.
Oh, it was pure poetry. So back in the first VCT qualifier that my current 5-stack ever played in, we lost in the round of 128 to NRG 0-2. That was literally our first match as a team. It was like 42 hours after Iconic joined the roster as the final 5th. And so to be able to now come full circle with that and 2-0 NRG in our best performance in a VCT event thus far, oh man, I'll take that any day of the week. It was a hell of a match as well. Like the games were fairly close, and I think we just came in knowing exactly what our plan was, and frankly not caring what they were going to do to us. We were going to play our game come hell or high water, and it worked. So
it's always a beautiful thing as well, where you're like, okay, the system works, right? Like, it was resilient to whatever they tried to throw at us. We were able to topple it. We were able to take them down. So that's got to feel amazing to have that victory. And I was sort of going to save it for later, but we'll talk about it now. It does feel like your stocks have just skyrocketed here. You were talking about the fact that you were on Valoranting yesterday. You're on this podcast today. Obviously, you've been on this podcast a few times as a friend of the show. We love having you on here. But it does feel like Virtuoso in general is a team that people are talking about a lot more now. Obviously, taking that kind of an upset win will do that. But in this conversation that's been floating around the scene, which, again, we'll get into a little bit more specifically later on, where it does feel like some of these teams that are grinders, that are really trying to fight their way up on the rank, have toppled some of the more established veterans of the scene. You guys are really at the forefront of that conversation, and the other team at the forefront of that conversation is unfortunately the team that beat you, the Kansas City Pioneers. So talking about that matchup a little bit more, what happened there, man?
The way I've been talking about it to people is that they should have gone into that as the heavy favorites against us. They're a signed team that has been signed before. Not only that, but we had beaten them repeatedly. We were undefeated against them preceding this matchup. And while a lot of people look at that and say, oh, well, you've beaten them before, you should definitely beat them now, that's how that works, I strongly disagree. This is like an abstract coaching philosophy thing, but it's almost like a weird competitive adaptation of that old saying, like, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you, or vice versa, rather. Basically, the way it works is if I beat you once, that's great. That means that I'm doing my job. If I beat you twice, that means that you're failing to adapt based off of the lessons I taught you the first time. If I beat you 3 times in a row, it means that you're literally not paying attention. And you're not taking a single lesson from anything, because each time I beat you, I'm literally handing you a textbook on how to not lose to me next time. So if you're not adapting based off of that, you're doing something horrendously wrong. There's just no 2 ways around it. So if we had gone into this matchup undefeated against them and still managed to beat them, then I would have zero faith in their ability to succeed as a roster, because we had given them everything they needed to come into this prepared. So should we have been able to still win? Yes, but it would have been an extreme burden of presumptuous adaptation on our end. Like, we would have to have made tons of calls on, we expect them to adapt to us this way, we expect them to adapt to us this way, and that's exactly what we did. I made a ton of prep work in terms of not just anti-stratting, but anti-stratting what I expected them to anti-strat. And we ran into a couple of issues where we outplayed ourselves because we expected them to anti-strat stuff, and they just didn't, flatly. And so we were expecting them to adapt to us. We played around an assumed adaptation, that just never came, and we just shot ourselves in our foot. If we had played our just stock strategy, it would have worked flawlessly in some of those rounds. So a bit of give and take, and it's just one of those weird situations where this was the deepest run we'd ever made as a roster. I think there were a lot of jitters involved, and I mean, we'll come back better than the next one. Like I said, each time someone beats you, they give you a textbook on how not to lose the next time, and I'll be damned if we come up against KCP again, it's going to be a different outcome. So.
Well, also, the really exciting thing for you guys, and we talked about this a little bit before we went on air, is every VCT run you've had has been better than the last. The steady improvement is very clear in that roster, and that speaks to a desire to improve and as you said, sort of study what's going on there. So I understand, you're setting up the feint. You're like, all right, they're going to read into this, and then they just don't. It's like, okay, we're a little bit thrown for a loop here. Regain, guys. It could be challenging because you're trying to stay a step ahead of them. You're trying to basically, there's the shadow boxing before the boxing, right? You're trying to anticipate what they're going to want to do, and when that game plan isn't matching up with your expectation, can really get you thrown. Talking about some of the other matchups that we had in here, obviously version 1 rolls through, Sentinels rolls through. Our Reykjavik teams are still on pace for Berlin. With version 1, there's obviously the caveat of they're dealing with Thief playing. They don't have Zelsis right now. They're again going to have a stand-in, but as we saw in Reykjavik, that's not too much of a limitation for V1. They're pretty adaptable. Sentinels roll through Sonics. Let's see, any other spicy ones? Oh, let's talk about the T1 getting 13-0'd. It was still a 2-1 series, so I do want to put that caveat out there that they took a map off of Envy, but then Envy 13-0'd them. 13-0'd them on Haven. What do you make of this T1 roster?
I think that it is promising. That it's all the cop out word whenever talking about new rosters is being like they have potential, but I feel like that's genuinely the only thing you can say about this T1 roster right now. I will be fully candid and blunt, and this might be the type of thing I get flamed on Reddit for saying, but when Dazed got dropped, I was super happy. Because if you look at, that's nothing against Daze. That's not me being a hater. That's nothing to him personally. But objectively, if you look at the way that T1's performances worked, when Daze came into that roster is when they started having problems. Period. There's no butchering it. There's no working around it. Factually, that is when their biggest problems started happening.
Yeah.
And so to see him leave and them immediately start doing decently again, you can't help but be a little bit excited and be like, oh, wait. Are we back on track? So I think this roster does have a lot of upside potential. I think that there is a good chance that they get some magic happening again. And so I'm looking forward to see what they've got for us next. I mean, they're clearly making adjustments, having that big player turnover. So for them to lose to Envy, one of the more established teams in the scene, take it in stride. I don't see this as a big damning loss or anything of that sort.
I would tend to agree with that assessment. And they've got the victory over Ghost. Ghost's a solid team, as we've seen before. You still got some stuff to build on here. Obviously, the huge question mark for me with this roster is how Curry's going to adapt to taking the more active calling role. But he's a super talented player, so if he can adapt to that, that's a huge asset for the roster. So yeah, despite the 13-0, despite the memes there, I do agree with you that this was actually a more encouraging run, frankly, than I necessarily expected them to have. I've been a pretty big T1 hater recently, so I will wear that badge and say that I might be wrong. We'll see. I need more data points. Need more data points on this one, but I am willing to say maybe I'm wrong about this T1 roster, and maybe they do have some idea of what they're doing. We'll see. Moving on down the list there. Rise make it through. That's pretty exciting. Rise make it through. Can we get to the next page on this bracket? There we go. They take the victory over Cloud9 Blue. Cloud9 Blue, a team that people were very excited for. That came third, just missed out on spot in Reykjavik. Now getting trounced by Rise. How do we feel both about this Rise team and about the C9 team?
Oh, I think Rise's stonks are pretty damn high. I think that they're pretty insane. So, I mean, me and the Virtuoso guys, we're tier 2 grinders. We play all the events, the PK monthlies, the NSG weeklies, the NSG monthlies, if they exist, we're in them type of thing. And if you go back to May, Rise was playing in a couple, and they were scary as hell. They were insane. So the fact that Rise sort of dropped off the radar for 2 full months, they didn't play anything, and then they come back here and make it straight to closed, I'm like, holy shit, they haven't missed a step. They're coming in hot. So people should be paying attention to these guys big time. I think that if I were to assign a single team in this run, like just absurd upset potential of just stealing away a set from even some of the favorites in this, it would be Rise. Point blank. Like,
Ooh, I like
no
that.
question, they're my upset pick for this bracket.
All right, you heard it right here. Anderzz saying the dark horse team of the tournament, Rise. Pay attention to them, see if they can live up to that title. Over on top, the Gen.G Ambox game. This is theoretically based on their seeding an upset. I don't really think it's an upset. I am the #1 MCE stan. I will be that very upfront with that. I love me some Matthew C. Elmore. I think that Gen.G team is really fun to watch, very exciting in the way that they continue to grow. Obviously, Nature's now in the team, and I think that they're a very dangerous team to make a run here. Well, what do you make of Gen.G?
I agree 110%. I think that them beating Ambox is not an upset at all. I think that Gen.G, in terms of their trajectory as a roster since MCE joined, has been strictly upward. And so to see them continue that trend is not a surprise at all. I expected them to make closed, and at least in like my personal like mind ranking, they're a top 4 team in the region.
Yeah. I know that their expectations as an organization are to be in Berlin, right? Like, that's their expectation. They're not beating around the bush. They want to be top 1, top 2 in the region. They want that to be like an unquestioned statement, and that's the objective that's been set, that they're going to continue to try and work for, improving as a team. And we've seen that growth. Yeah, for the beginning of the year, really, when MCE came in, you've seen them get better in every competition. It's felt like there have been some stumbling blocks, some matches that they've lost, but this is a team that continues to, not to bring a pun from our previous dark horse, but that continues to rise. They look so good every time I watch them, and they're just fun to watch in terms of watching that growth. Version 1 beating Luminosity. This Version 1 team, indomitable. Like, this is such a talented roster, it seems, and they are so adaptable, and I think a lot of credit for that has to go to Imi, their coach, and also to Vanity in terms of the way that he's been calling. He's been very opinionated on Twitter lately about some of these upsets and what he didn't see as upsets, and about sort of the changing hierarchy here, and about the importance of being a grinder. So obviously he's been taking his own advice, and they're still doing very well. My question is, even with the limitation of not playing with Zelsis, of playing with Thief for this run, do you think they can qualify through in the closed?
I think it'll be a hell of a time, but do I think it's possible? Absolutely. So I think that the fact that they went to Iceland and still found fairly considerable success without Whippy was a huge deal. The fact that they're now coming into this event and still finding considerable success without Zelsis tells me that no matter what wrench you throw at him, Vanity's calls are going to make this team scary. Like, that is, I don't know the inner workings of this team. I don't know how much of it should be assigned to Imi as well, but like, just looking at this flatly from my completely subjective read, the way that version 1 performs tells me that Vanity is an insane IGL that you can mess with in any way you want, and he will still find wins with the team that he is given, which is a really, really scary thing to have to play against. So would they be able to make it through to Berlin? We'll see. It's gonna be hard. I mean, they're it seems that they are constantly having to deal with one problem or another, and I just want to see them be able to play at full strength, man. That's all I want at this point. Like, give me the real deal.
My genuine hope is, if they make Berlin, please don't let there be another issue with Whippy. Please let Whippy go. I know that it's a really weird situation for him in general. I'm hoping that they've got that figured out, just because, again, if anyone doesn't know, my understanding is that Whippy is here on a student visa in the U.S., and that's a huge part of what's made it an issue for, especially in the era of COVID, for leaving the country, because it's always a concern. Can you get back in? Can you leave? Are you allowed to leave by the terms of your visa? Like, what are the qualifications there? So hopefully whatever situation has been sorted out by version 1, and he's going to be fine to go, and that's going to be A-okay, because yes, it would be so cool to see this team on full strength. They did so well even with a stand and with Jamie standing in. What can they do with their full 5? I want to see it. I have one other question before we move on from this particular event, and this is a little bit more of a general question. We've been seeing a lot more Yoru. Yoru has been working his way into comps, been working his way into specific maps. He was pretty much untouched for a long time until this latest patch and this latest rework. You're a guy who has a lot of thoughts on compositions, on pick rates, things like that, has done a lot of work on it before. Do we think Yoru is the meta now? What do you think of Yoru?
Do I think he's meta? Not necessarily. Do I think that he has a lot of intrinsic capabilities that counter what a lot of teams are doing? Yes. Specifically, so we're seeing him a lot on Bind right now. That's like the marquee map where he's suddenly punching through way more than we've ever seen him before. And if you look at the meta on Bind in particular throughout the rest of NA, you're looking at a lot of like the Fnatic style double controller mid-rangey stuff, or Astra Viper control-y stuff. And what Yoru does as an agent is his gate crash allows him to either accelerate rotations, which allows you to work around utility better, or backline gate crash, which directly bypasses these sort of control-y elements that Astra Viper and double controller provide. So he's just a natural counter to what many of these teams are bringing. Whether or not that will last as we see a meta shift with KO coming into the mix, that's a completely different ballpark. But in terms of the meta that we see right now, it makes complete sense why Yoru is suddenly finding a lot more space and a lot more success.
This dovetails nicely into another question, which is just once KO is available to be played, is KO going to be a must pick?
On some maps, absolutely. I think there is going to be a very, very interesting series of sort of decisions made by the overarching meta over the next couple of weeks, which is how the hell does KO interact with Sova? Because that's the real question, is like, I can KO knife your Sova drone every time you throw it, assuming that I positioned my KO correctly on the map. There are a lot of teams that if you take away their Sova drone, they don't know how to take space anymore because they have garbage fundamentals. And how is that going to affect certain teams? I feel like there are certain teams are about to get exposed hard, and it's going to be an interesting time.
I love that. I love that. All right, here's the statement. Here's the headline. KO is going to expose teams' garbage fundamentals. Every team that drops off when KO
Perfect.
interrupted, Anderzz just said they're trash. Quote it, clip it, ship it. We'll see if we can get you in trouble here. But no, I love the idea, and I 100% agree with that. And it's the idea, right, behind that agent is to bring people back to basics, to force people to reckon with their fundamentals, with the way that you clear, with the way that you play off each other, the way you trade, things like that, that my CS brain loves. And I'm very frustrated when I see players get away with stuff that they shouldn't get away with, that are wildly ill-advised plays without the context of a utility blanket to get you out of it. So I'm super excited to see teams get punished for that kind of stuff. Let's shuffle on. Talk about EU for a little bit. We're going to hop across the pond here. We're going to talk about some of the EU stuff that's going on. Obviously, the results are actively rolling in from the closed portion, or the main event portion, they call it, of the EU Challengers run. But we've got our teams that initially made it through. Talk about them. It was Send, Liquid, G2 Guild, Fnatic, Rix, BDS, and FPX made it through. This feels like Rix making it over Alliance was sort of the big upset, if you will. This one felt a lot more, shall we say, expected results. Would you agree with that, Anderzz?
Yeah, 100% on all fronts. I think that all of this was as expected, with the sole exclusion of Rix being like, whoa, where did these guys come from?
They've been playing together for a while, though, so I mean, it's a good result for them. We'll see how they do against Ascent today, since that Ascent team we know can be absolutely nuts. Now, talking about the top, the Fnatic team Liquid game, I got to watch little bits and pieces of that this morning, but that is a really exciting matchup that we've seen a bunch of times. Fnatic come out on top of it today and continue to make the run. Obviously, those are the two Reykjavik teams that we had. Now, maybe they wind up the two Berlin teams. Don't know about that. But some pretty exciting matchups here coming through. Also, again, just so nice to see double Elim in an EU tournament, man. It's so nice. I just love it.
They've had a ton of streams, too. Imagine double Elim and being able to watch.
Yeah, it's been fun. I've been catching up with Ryan's stream. I've been bugging Mitchman and Tom Biz. It's a lot of fun to actually be able to watch these games and think about the teams as opposed to looking at the scoreline and being like, how did that happen? Round of applause, golf clap. Can I do that with an iPad in hand? Here. That's my round of applause. Not the most effective, but we'll go for it. Celebrate it. Freaks 4, you're figuring it out. We love that. Love to see that. EU riots, figuring out what people actually want to see. And people have been having a lot of fun with it as well. I always do love the ridiculous ways that Mitch manages to insert his cams. Ooh, there we go. That he manages to insert his cams into various places on different maps to have some fun with it. So, I don't know. Anything that's particularly caught your eye here in this EU event? Anything that's got the juices flowing? We're both a little more NA-centric these days, but
Yeah,
what you
so
think about
I
it?
would say the things that are most interesting to me right now is whether or not FPX chokes for the 90 millionth time, and whether or not New G2 is the super team that they are, at least by immediate appearances, seeming to be.
Yes.
New G2 seems like genuine terror-inducing, real deal type of stuff, and I want to see whether or not that plays out in its entirety.
I would love to see that as well, because that's what they were in the initial period, right? Where it's just like G2, everybody else. And then eventually the fact that they were relying on raw mechanics to a larger degree got exposed, and teams caught up and figured things out and figured out how to shut them down. Now they've got a lot more fundamentals, getting back to that conversation. They've got a lot more coordination and team play. And yeah, maybe Carlos has successfully built his supers team that he so desires. They're just such a fun brand that you really do just want them to make events because they have so much and they contribute so much to the carnival around it, if you will. So it's hard to root against G2, even when they're like playing themselves as the villain and trying to portray themselves. Like, that's fun. It's like wrestling. You want to heal. You want somebody there who's gonna not afraid to sort of spit in the face of the crowd and get weird with it. And to me, G2 is always that. And also, they're just throwing a bunch of money at getting the best team together that they possibly can. So that's exciting. Yeah, so we'll see how they do. We'll see how they continue to do. Europe's a lot of fun. Check it out, folks. If you're not watching the EU events, it's probably happening right now. But don't tune away from us just yet. Wait until this show wraps up. Then go watch EU. I don't want to work against my own self-interests. I almost throw my iPad here. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. But I have some questions for you now. I have some questions for you because this is a little bit different from our typical show in that it's just the two of us. You've just had a really good run with Virtuoso, obviously. So I figured I'd take this time to ask you some questions. We've already gotten into some of these things, but talking more a little bit about your coaching philosophy. I know you're a super data-driven guy. You worked as an analyst before. Your YouTube content has all been very based around stats, analysis, like looking at compositions, things like that. How are you bringing that sort of mind for statistics, that mind for data crunching, into the role of a coach?
So it's really an interesting exercise. Like you said, my professional past is that I was a quantitative analyst in the finance industry. So I am, like, by professional training, a huge geek. That's the official title.
Yeah.
Coming over to esports, I mean, I've played competitive games my entire life. I was a World of Warcraft arena player back in 2009. I was highly competitive in League of Legends for multiple years, and it's always been the case that I have tried to boil games down to their underlying game code and just min-max the hell out of them. That's just how I approach games. I'm a weirdo like that. And after working in finance and getting really a formalized skill set to do that at the highest levels, being able to come back and apply it has been a wild experience. Being able to not just have the statistical skills and do the hard math, but then have the fundamental understanding to be able to contextualize those statistics and convert them into actual actions is what I live for. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that people will encounter. I mean, you always have the classic references to, like, Moneyball, where it was used in baseball and, like, revolutionized the industry. I think that there's a movement right now where people in esports are becoming more and more accepting of the fact that you have to use analytics to be able to keep up. But how you use those analytics is a lot easier than it may, or a lot less easy than it may immediately appear. It's one thing to have cool stats that you can look at and be like, oh, this is cool. Let's throw it up on a screen for broadcast because people will find it cool. And a stat that you can look at it and say, this drives an actionable objective for my team that's going to make us better. Those are two incredibly different things. And being able to differentiate between them makes a good coach.
Now, speaking about those, and especially applying it to Valorant in particular, in Valorant, since the meta is so frequently shifting, since we had these big patches, like this big patch that just came through, radically shifted the values of different agents in terms of utility and what they can buy and all that, when you're looking at historic data sets and trying to draw a conclusion from that, and then you're trying to apply that and sort of project it into a future meta, how do you sort of tweak and adjust that? I guess is my question. How do you adapt to the changing meta?
So a lot of it has to do with understanding what variables are changing. It's always going to be the case where you can't just say, "All right, I have all this historical data. We're going into a patch where everyone's econ changed and now KO exists, and it all is still applicable," because that's just a load of nonsense. You can, however, take things that you know are going to be relative constants. These agent combos still work incredibly well in terms of win rate on certain maps. This new agent is a vague analog to agent X, Y, or Z in terms of its compositional implications with these other pieces. And you can sort of ham-fist your way through it until you get a sample that you can use with reasonable confidence under those new conditions.
Talking about data analysts, I also find that there is an odd crossover between people who enjoy that kind of work and people who are really into esports. Anecdotally, there's you. We've got Mame, obviously, who came over from finance. Also, Nerfed used to work as a systems consultant. He may still. I'm not exactly sure what he's doing these days, but I do know that. I know there's a big crossover there. Do you think that there's a natural allure that brings people with a similar skill set into the game?
I think that it's funny because I don't think it's as much that people with those skill sets come to esports. I think it's that people who have always loved games and thought that way end up in those careers a lot of the time. Because I came from being like an analytical esports loving guy and then ended up working in finance because I think that growing up, it just inbuilt a very strong like systems thinking, logic based process in my approach to things, and it just translated naturally. And so I think it's a chicken or the egg sort of situation.
I like that. Talking about Virtuoso, your team's now been together for a while, right? You talked about the VCT runs, the first VCT run after you had your 5, where you got trounced by NRG, now beating NRG in this run. You've had that consistency. I feel like there's a lot of turnover in the Valorant space right now, which is a thing that's been historically attributed to NA. We had that problem in NACS where it feels like you're always trying to change a piece. But now it feels like teams are trying to change a piece based on the meta. They're like, okay, the meta has shifted, so sign this guy who plays this agent. It's like, well, the meta's going to shift again. Consistency as an asset. Talk to me about that in terms of what you've been able to achieve with Virtuoso.
So the consistency is huge, not only in terms of developing your players. I mean, you're referencing the situation where a lot of rosters are making changes based off of a meta adjustment. So like, we need this agent, this guy doesn't play this agent, so let's switch players. No. You got to figure out a way that your current players can play those roles. Otherwise, point blank, that roster's never going to go pro and you're wasting your time. You should just not have that team in the first place if you can't make that kind of adjustment. I'm sorry. But beyond that, one of the biggest lacking attributes for teams in competitive Valorant right now are those fundamentals I was talking about, especially at the tier 2 level. You're talking about teams that if you don't give them free info tools, they have no idea how to take space. And that is the highest learning curve thing that a lot of these teams are going to encounter. And it's because that's such a high learning curve that you're not going to climb it if you don't stick it out with each other. The hardest thing, and debatably the most critical thing to learn right now for these teams that are going to help them bridge that gap from tier 2 to tier 1 is not something you're going to learn in a month. It's not something you're going to learn in 2 months. My guys have been together 6 months, and we're still climbing that curve. So the fact that people are like, we didn't make it to finals in this NSG for the 3rd week, time to throw in the towel. Like, come on, guys. Get your act together. You have to actually commit to this if you want to be serious about it. It is a process. You have to lay out a feedback loop where we make changes, we adjust to the changes, we assess if they're working, repeat, and do that day after day, week after week, month after month, and I promise you it will work. If you need evidence, look at my guys. That's all you need.
Now, talking about a little bit about putting in time, day after day, week after week. There's been a lot of debate. We touched on it a couple times here, especially when talking about version 1 and Vanity, because he's been tweeting about it a lot in terms of needing to put a lot of time into this game to understand it and to keep up with it. Talking about the grinders, saying that looking at some of the upsets that he's seen, they're not upsets because who's been putting in crazy time and who barely touches the game outside of official practice. Do you agree with that? Do you think that the grind is necessary to keep up with Valorant?
100%. And It's dangerous to use that word, grind. I think grind has a lot of negative connotations to it. I think that there's a lot of like toxic work culture built into that phrase. I think that like a better way of framing it overall is to say that people need to be committed. You're not grinding, you are committing to staying up to date with the game. That can be you watching VODs. That doesn't necessarily mean that like you go play 8 scrim blocks and then you play 12 solo queue games and sleep 3 hours. Like that is not what I'm talking about when people are saying grind. Like they mean that you are trying to actively always get better at the game. Like something that we say in our team on a regular basis is that you aren't going to sleep until you're better than when you woke up. That is grinding to me. It has nothing to do with the amount of workload put in. It has nothing to do with how many hours in the day you were allocating to the game. It has to do with whether or not you are making active progress.
Okay. I like that. I am very interested in that. Do you also agree with the impression? I don't know how privy you are to maybe some of the players on the top teams who have maybe had some more disappointing results, but are you also in agreement with it? There are players who definitely aren't putting in the time that's necessary and have maybe been coasting a little bit on some of their past laurels?
Oh, 100%. I hate to use the term because it is just flatly toxic, but it applies here. There are currently people in Tier 1 Valorant that are stealing paychecks. I'm just going to say it.
You want to get real spicy? Name names?
No. I'm not going that far. I don't want to actually be crucified, so I'll pass on that for now.
That's fair. That's fair. I won't press you on that one. All right. So there are pros at the top level who are stealing paychecks, who aren't putting in the time, that's necessary. And I mean, especially with a game that's so fresh still. We've just hit our year anniversary. Like, the scene is still very much being defined. We've had one international LAN. You got to time on task. You can't rest on laurels because there really aren't laurels for most players. Like, your results from First Strike, who cares? Your results from this, who cares? Like, you gotta achieve new things to actually build a legacy now in this game. It's interesting. It is very interesting because, especially coming from a CS mentality, where especially in NA we had the opposite problem, where we would have players who were just putting in hours upon hours upon hours pugging, but that was building really lousy habits a lot of the time, over peaking, taking these fights that you have from pug games. And I would think that in Valorant the same could apply, where the strats that work in your solo queue Radiant game, they're not going to work against 100 Thieves. It's just going to be a completely different style of play. But it seems like the opposite's been there, where it's just the more iterations, the more time checking meta and what people are doing with agents, it can come through. So do you think there's a risk of instilling bad habits if you're just putting in tons of hours playing the game solo?
Yeah, so I think that there's a very fine balance. I think that solo queue definitely has its advantages. There are a lot of pros who will play scrims and then hang it up for the day. That's literally all they do because they think that solo queue is a complete waste of time. I think that if you have that mentality, your job's going to be gone in a year. Because at the end of the day, like, solo queue is a way to upkeep mechanical skills, and it's a way to get a bead on niche utility usage. There's going to be wild stuff coming out of solo queuers that you're not going to see in tier 2, you're not going to see in tier 1, but it's still good. Like, there are, like, people can meme all they want on, like, TikTok Sage walls or whatever the hell else it is. Some of those are genuinely strong and get used in pro matches and net rounds to teams. Like, that's just facts. You can't argue with it. So to say that solo queue has no value is just demonstrably false, and people need to be aware of that and wake up to that reality.
Now, talking about, you talked about Tier 1, Tier 2, we've talked about it, we've referenced that, a few different times. I think that there's been a huge compression in North America that's blurred a lot of the lines. We still have our top teams, right? You've got your version 1s, you've got your Sentinels, obviously, who are still competing at the top, and then you look at, like, an XSET, and I would say even, like, a Gen G, who are pretty consistently performing there. You've got the teams that are, like, always making it to the next level and then competing at the top tier of sort of these challenges runs, these qualifier runs. But below that, it feels like it's gotten so muddy. You've got teams like the Kansas City Pioneers coming up. You've got Rise coming up. We've got teams like the Renegades and Complexity and Sonics, who've been making all these runs in the Nerd Street Gamers event, competing towards Summer Champs, competing in the Opens, playing every step that they can. You've got teams like Andbox that were sort of towards the top that are maybe falling off. Luminosity's been pretty lackluster with their changes. We won't worry about TSM, but that's obvious to anyone who's watching. Like, it feels like the lines between, like, maybe Tier 1 still defined, but Tier 2 through 5, like, there's a lot of colors muddying there. Is that the way it feels as a coach?
Well, it depends on exactly like where you define those thresholds. The way that I see it is there's like still a fairly defined like best through fifth or sixth best team in the region that
Okay.
shouldn't be dropping games to teams below them. I think that the next like 7 to 10 teams should be winning at least like 70% of their games. But then everything below that, up until like the 30th best team of the region, they could trade wins on the daily. Like it's a complete madhouse from there on out. It's just a soup. So
That's fun. I mean, as someone who's on a team that's on the come up of Virtuoso, that's got to be pretty exciting. Where you're like, yeah, we're matching up against them. Like they've done this, but we can beat them.
well, I mean, it's one of the reasons that like the runs are happening. Why we've sort of risen in public opinion to the place that we have is because we're one of the teams proving that you can't really say, oh, this team is ranked 15, so they're just objectively better than this team that's ranked 25. Like we were ranked 27, and then we beat who was seeded 6th in all of VCT. Like there is a very small gap at all at this point.
Now, talking about Stonk Watch, because Stonk Watch is always fun. Talking about Stonk Watch, Virtuoso Stonks have been skyrocketing here. I mean, we talked about it. Obviously, this latest run is a huge thing. Your public profile's going up. It's much more impressive. You said that there might be some org reach outs in the works, getting some sniffs, getting some stuff going on. Anything in particular you want to talk about?
People have eyes on us. I will say that much. We obviously like we've been together for 6 months as a 5 stack. For 3 of the players, I will have worked with them for almost a full year here in the next couple of weeks. So we aren't in a rush. Like we are and have been committed to our process. We're going to continue to grow whether or not we get signed, but the availability for us to go full-time would be tremendous. Imagine if this is what we're doing, with us being pulled a million different directions, imagine what we could do full-time. That's all I'm going to say.
I like it. I like the pitch. I also think that it is very interesting, again, when you're taking wins over a team like NRG, where a team like NRG, it feels like they're throwing a lot of money at this team, and they have no clue where they're going, right? A player gets swapped out every week, coach gets swapped, this gets changed, that gets changed. I made a joke on the last show that the poor NRG social guy, every week, they're like, okay, so we've added the new player to the roster. It's like, I need to make another announcement video? Shit, how am I going to make a new, interesting Valorant announcement video? I've made like 20 this month. Like, what am I going to do here? Whereas you've got a project that's stable, that's been working together, that's been building, that's been improving, all while dealing with the realities of being unsigned players, of having to secure money, having to secure this, having to spend time doing other things. It is an interesting mentality shift. So if you're out there, you represent an org, you're looking to get into Valorant, or maybe you got a team that you're not so happy with, and you're thinking maybe we just abandon that project, go to a new one. I'm just saying, there's these guys here, Virtuoso. That's stability right there. They're pulling upsets. They're getting better event to event. There's trackable progress there. They've got groundswell support in the community. People are excited to see them play. And you got this handsome devil here as the coach, who's got a lot of experience. He does content. He makes content. They can make content for your org. I think there's a lot of pitches here. You got anything you want to add to that pitch here? Because we are just about wrapping up our show.
You're already making me blush enough. I think I'm good.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. We are going to be doing a little bit of a pre-show for the VCT event this weekend, the VCT closed event this weekend. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be airing before the VCT on Thursday and on Saturday. And this guy's going to be a part of it as well. So we'll get more detail, more insight from him on some of the teams there, some of the matchups that are coming up. Be sure to tune in for that. If you enjoyed the show, please follow this gentleman on Twitter. You can see his @ down below his face. It is @Anderzz with 2 Z's TV. Follow him on Twitter. A very interesting follow. Lots of opinions about Valorant, obviously, and clearly an expert. So give him a follow. Follow this channel. Follow Nerd Street Gamers on Twitter as well to find out the next time we're going live. It'll be every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So be sure to tune into the next one, or I guess it's Eastern Daylight Time now. I always forget about that one. But be sure to tune in. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you on the next Press 4 to Defuse. Bye-bye, everybody.